This is Global Insights by Network 2020, and today we felt it was crucial to follow up on our last episode on the humanitarian impact of the Israel-Palestine conflict and revisit a second conversation from that conflict in 2021.
That I'm very confident that in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it is, we're going to have this resumption of fighting like we saw. The term cycle of violence gets thrown around, but in this case, it really is a cycle, and it's a predictable one.
2 years ago, the world watched in horror as violence erupted once again in Israel and Gaza, leaving entire communities in ruins. We recorded a critical discussion then, seeking answers to the questions of why and what's next. But here we are in 2023, a mirror of the past, with new casualties, new crises, and renewed tensions. Today's suffering reflects a tragic cycle, so we're revisiting our conversation with Michael Koplow, Policy Director of the Israel Policy Forum, and answering some urgent questions with lessons from the past. What role does the United States play in this ongoing conflict?
The U.S. is always going to look at Israel as a critical military ally.
How do these recurrent clashes impact the lives and futures of ordinary Palestinians and Israelis?
Prime Minister Netanyahu has had a purposeful policy of keeping Hamas in power in Gaza. Let's keep the PA in power in the West Bank in a weakened state, and let's keep Hamas in power in Gaza in a weakened state.
And can lasting peace ever be achieved?
There is this sense that Israel will never allow a Palestinian state, and also that it's time to move on.
Moderating the discussion was Courtney Doggart, president of Network 2020.
This is a very difficult topic to wade into, and as I've told you and others, in I think the 5 years since I've been running Network 2020, we haven't done a briefing on Israel and Palestine, and I think in part because it's so it's just such a sticky and complicated and emotional situation, but it's obviously well worth addressing, particularly now. And so if you could just start us off from what you're looking at now, there's a ceasefire. Where do you see things headed from here in terms of prospects for peace?
There are two questions here. One is about prospects for peace in the sense of, quiet and no more fighting. And one is a question about the prospects for an actual long-term negotiated solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Tammy Wittes, Elon Goldenberg, and I actually wrote a report for the Center for New American Security that was released in December, if memory serves me correctly. And that report was 70 pages of our best effort at arguing what a new American approach toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should be. Our frame there was basically that it is important to keep on working toward two states, but that it hasn't worked for a quarter century. And it's also important to not let that get in the way of other progress on the ground. And other progress meaning advancing security and prosperity for everybody, whether they're Israeli or Palestinian. And that gets to both parts of this question. So, I'll deal with the second one first. Getting to a long-term two-state outcome is really difficult. There are lots of things that have to come into place for it to even be plausible to work toward it at the moment. On the Israeli side of the political spectrum, nobody's talking about two states. People will recall that last summer the momentum was toward annexation, not toward two states. Within the past 4 Israeli campaigns, nobody has talked about a two-state outcome. Nobody's talked about negotiations with the Palestinians. There's this widespread sense that it simply is not possible, and that maybe down the road, but that at the moment it's not possible, and that it's not even advisable. And that's why you see people talking about things like annexation, an effort to sort of just move beyond two states and get rid of it forever. On the Palestinian side, you have people, I alluded to this before in terms of the Fatah-Hamas split and why Fatah is monumentally unpopular. There is this sense that Israel will never allow a Palestinian state, and also that it's time to move on. And what you see, particularly from younger Palestinians under the age of 40, where about 70% of Palestinians support support this different approach. What they say is this should be a struggle not for a state of Palestine. It should be a struggle for Palestinian human rights, and that means Israeli citizenship. And within Palestinian society writ large, at this point, you have something like 37 or 38% of Palestinians who still support two states. And you have 32, 33% of Palestinians who say, no, we want Israeli citizenship. Let's turn this from a national struggle into a human rights struggle. And so on both sides, the momentum against two states is building. And, this may be, this would be a much longer answer, and so maybe for another time, but, conditions on the ground, contrary to popular belief, where there is lots of focus on this idea that two states is no longer possible, that separation is no longer possible, that's actually not true. It's become more complicated in the past few years, but getting two states is actually still possible. It's a question of political will. And at the moment, on the Israeli side, there is almost no political will for it. And on the Palestinian side, there may still be some political will, but the momentum, particularly in Palestinian society, is moving in another direction. Now, with all that, we turn to the first part of this, which is whether peace in the sense of preventing more fighting between the two sides, like we just saw, is possible. And there it definitely is possible. But what has to happen is a fundamental shakeup of the situation between Israel and Hamas. Something that is widely accepted inside of Israel as facts, but either is not known here or is for some reason kind of dismissed by people, is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has had a purposeful policy of keeping Hamas in power in Gaza. And when I say that's not in question inside of Israel, it's not in question on anyone's part. And the Prime Minister takes criticism of it from the right, where they say this is ridiculous, we should be going in full force and removing Hamas. And he takes criticism from the left, where they say this is a terrible policy, you should be boosting the Palestinian Authority. But the reason Prime Minister Netanyahu has worked to keep Hamas in power is precisely because it's convenient to say, we can't negotiate toward two states because the Palestinians are divided. How can we negotiate with a terrorist organization in Gaza? Which, by the way, is a perfectly valid and legitimate point, except that the Prime Minister has actively worked to keep it that way. And so the policy has effectively been, let's keep the PA in power in the West Bank in a weakened state, and let's keep Hamas in power in Gaza in a weakened state. Now, in the past few days since the fighting has ended, there have been more calls to end that situation and to work to get the Palestinian Authority back into power in Gaza. And the only way to avert more fighting in the future and having another round like this is that scenario. Because if Israeli policy remains the same, which is to keep the blockade as it is on Gaza, and to also facilitate Qatari monthly payments into Gaza, which Israel's been doing now for years, and it really keeps Hamas weakened but in power, what's going to happen is the people in Gaza suffer because you have this blockade. Hamas diverts much of the supplies that come in. They get the payments from the Qataris, and they get the benefits of spreading those payments around, and they remain exactly where they are. And they keep a tight control on reconstruction and on humanitarian assistance and on really everything. So, what has to happen to avert something like this is for humanitarian aid to flow to Gaza unimpeded, but for reconstruction to really be handed to the United Nations and to the Palestinian Authority. And at the moment, Hamas has no reason to let that happen. But it has to be a real concerted effort where Hamas is basically put to a choice, where the international community, the U.S., the Egyptians, the United Nations, the Gulf states, and the Palestinian Authority all say with one voice, we are willing to come back in and really reconstruct Gaza, but Hamas cannot have a hand in it. And have Hamas basically have to publicly say, okay, we're going to let this happen, and by so doing erode their own power, or have them publicly say, no, that's not acceptable to us, and really have the blame fall on them. And if that doesn't happen, then I'm very confident that in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it is, we're going to have this resumption of fighting like we saw, because it is this, the term cycle of violence gets thrown around, but in this case, it really is a cycle and it's a predictable one.
Thank you. On the topic of shifting sentiment, I wanted to turn a little bit to the U.S. because I think it's hard to have a conversation about that involves Israel without involving the U.S. I was looking at some Gallup polls recently, and while there shows among Americans overwhelming support still for the Israelis, there is over the past few years just creeping public support for Palestinians. So could you touch a little bit on both the public opinion piece of how the U.S. can play into this, as well as what's happening on Capitol Hill in Washington? Thanks.
So the U.S. is always going to look at Israel as a critical military ally because, when push comes to shove, there really is no replacement for Israel in terms of defense and intelligence capabilities in the Middle East. And the United States works hand in glove with Israel in all sorts of ways on security issues. From terrorism to countering Iran to what have you. So that is not going to change. And I think that when people expect the United States to end security assistance to Israel, for instance, that's just not something that's going to happen, having nothing to do with public opinion, having to do with Israel's role in geopolitics and Israel's role with regard to U.S. interests in the region. But what we see, and on the Democratic side of the aisle, there is wide recognition of that. And on the Republican side, certainly that's taken as an article of faith. And I think that when we look at President Biden's response to the fighting, what we saw was, President Biden basically giving the Israelis free rein to deal with Hamas militarily, something the Israelis felt they had to do because starting off the fighting by shooting rockets at Jerusalem was viewed as an escalation. And also, Hamas's rockets this time had larger payloads and were much longer range than the IDF expected. And so, President Biden, I think, wanted to give Israel the chance to respond to Hamas militarily and try to establish some sort of deterrence. And when we saw President Biden's rhetoric shift last Wednesday, where for the first time, he publicly said to the Israelis, "I expect you in the next 24 hours to start de-escalating toward a ceasefire." I think that part of that was sort of baked in because the IDF and the Israeli political establishment do not want to they don't want to send ground forces into Gaza. And so when you are doing this entirely by the air, at some point, there are only so many targets, and in terms of Hamas rocket launching pits and the Hamas tunnel system underneath. And so, I think that the IDF was winding down as it was. And so President Biden, understood that. And so, he came out with what he said when he did, knowing that this was going to wind down, I think, in the next day or two anyway. And so in some ways, he gets the political benefit by calling for it. And within Israel, they get, Prime Minister Netanyahu sort of got a political benefit by appearing to stand up to President Biden and say, no, we'll stop when we want. But everybody knew it was winding down. Now, within Congress, what you see on the Democratic side, I think, are really three groups. There's one group that is on the right, and one says we're not going to criticize anything Israel is doing while there are rockets coming from Gaza. There's another group on the left, which says Israeli actions are completely unacceptable and calls to condition security assistance even as rockets are falling. Then you have the largest group in the middle. And this is where 80 to 90%, I think, of Democratic members of Congress are, where they recognize the importance of Israeli security. They think of themselves as pro-Israel. They don't want to be seen as anything but pro-Israel. But they also recognize that Palestinian rights are important, and they want to figure out a way to both support Israel's security and also stand up for the Palestinians. And you saw this tension, frankly, in the lead up to the fighting between Israel and Hamas, where you had many members of Congress who were expressing concern about the Sheikh Jarrah evictions, who were expressing concern about what we saw in East Jerusalem and things going on in the Temple Mount. You saw it in the middle of the fighting when Senator Menendez, somebody who's generally thought of as being hawkish on these issues, released a statement where he said rockets are unacceptable. Israel has every right to respond, but I am concerned about events in East Jerusalem, and I'm concerned about the reports of Israel demolishing the building in Gaza that contained the offices of the Associated Press and Al Jazeera. That's an effort, I think, to try to walk this line and to take into account the fact, as you point out, that increasingly Americans and even quicker, even more so, Americans who vote Democrat or who affiliate as Democratic, increasingly they look at this and they say, either we support Israel and the Palestinians equally, or among younger Democrats, we sympathize with the Palestinians more than we do with the Israelis. And so that's where Democrats are. They're trying to keep all of these things in mind. And I think that it's causing some of these tensions, and I think that people are still trying to figure out how best to support Israeli security, but also push the Israelis a bit on some of the things they do on the ground, particularly with regard to Jerusalem. And public opinion on this is I think where it is. It's not going to shift away. I don't think people are going to start dropping their concerns for Palestinian rights and for Palestinian sovereignty. And so far, I see very little evidence in Israel that the Israeli government or that Israelis in general understand the way in which public opinion here is shifting. And I think that the Israeli government is going to have to, also come to terms with that and figure out what it wants to do going forward. Because if it proceeds as it has with things like evictions and with things like home demolitions, it's going to encounter more and more resistance within the United States. And as I said up top, there's a limit to where that's going to go, because again, Israel is always going to be an important security ally. But as people point out all the time, this notion of a special U.S.-Israel relationship does not rest on the idea of Israel as a defense and intelligence ally. It rests on this notion of shared values. And the more that Americans question this idea of shared values, the more difficult it's going to be for Israel, I think, to maintain its position in the United States.
All right. Thank you for that. Do sectors of the Palestinians and some Middle East countries still question Israel's right to exist? So kind of playing into what we saw happen at the end of the Trump administration and the Abraham Accords, how is that larger sentiment shifting, or is it not?
I think there are sectors of Palestinians everywhere who still question Israel's right to exist, right? Hamas being the most prominent example, which is constructed around denying Israel's right to exist. So the answer is yes, but I think that Palestinians over time, not all of them, but certainly over time have shifted, right? If you look at the PLO, for instance, right, the PLO initially, back to its founding in 1964, questioned Israel's right to exist. The point was to recover all of Palestine. And remember, this is before 1967, before Israeli occupation. And up until 1988, when the PLO officially shifted course, it did not recognize Israel's right to exist. And then it shifted course in 1988, right? So, Hamas is still very much in the camp of not recognizing Israel's legitimacy. I'm not sure that I'm confident Hamas will ever change, but the point is that Palestinians themselves, have moved over time. And as we see more and more Palestinians talking about just wanting Israeli citizenship, that in itself is a tacit acceptance of Israel's right to exist. Now, some people would look at that and say it's a double-edged sword, because if Palestinians en masse say we want to be citizens of Israel, what it ultimately means is that Israel no longer exists as a Jewish state. And so some people would look at that and say this in itself is a denial of Israel's right to exist. That's a much larger, complicated question. I think that there's probably evidence for both sides of that position. But there are always going to be Palestinians who accept Israel's right to exist, and there are always going to be Palestinians who don't. By the same token, there are Israelis and Jews, non-Israeli Jews, who also take both these positions, right? There are Israelis, particularly those who advocate a two-state outcome, who accept the rights of Palestinians to have a sovereign state of their own. There are Israelis who will say that there is no such thing as a Palestinian. So, this problem exists on both sides. What I would love to see is on both sides for everyone to accept the other's right to exist in a sovereign state and then figure out how to get there. Because if Palestinians deny Israel's legitimacy, it's not going to lead to any positive outcome. I'll tell you, there is no scenario in which Israelis are going to agree to give up Israel as a Jewish state. And on the other side, if there are Israelis or non-Israeli Jews who don't accept the right to a Palestinian state, then the conflict will go on forever.
Thank you. Oh, just one quick follow-up. Do you happen to know, when it comes to the Palestinians who are increasingly amenable to the idea of, not looking at a Palestinian state, but looking at citizenship within Israel, are there generational divides on that front that you've seen?
Oh yeah, big generational divides. Older Palestinians, who grew up kind of in the era of Palestinian nationalism, very much still want their own state. I don't think it's a coincidence that the leadership of Fatah is almost all older Palestinian leaders, whereas younger Palestinians, and this is not just a Palestinian issue, right? I mean, you see this around the world, right? Sort of the idea that that national identity is less important. The idea that that borders should be more porous, a focus on human rights and a focus on equality, as opposed to a focus on national rights. I think that's something that you see among younger people all over the world versus older generations. Within Palestinian society, you really see it. And I'll say in my own conversations with Palestinians, it's difficult to find Palestinians who are either my contemporaries or who are younger than me. I'm 41, just to date myself. It's hard to find Palestinians of my generation or younger who are really excited about the idea of Palestinian nationalism. What really motivates them is a sense of equality and justice, and they look at their Israeli counterparts, and in many cases their Israeli friends, who have all sorts of rights they don't have, and they don't have a good answer as to why that should ever be the case.
Thank you. Thanks for that. We have a question they ask: how could the USA even pretend to be an honest broker in the Israel-Palestinian conflicts when it is so pro-Israel and still gives Israel $3.8 billion in aid, used mostly for weaponry? And again, I'm repeating the question. I have not fact-checked this. Perhaps the Palestinians should call on help from Russia or China to tilt the balance in their favor. So just kind of broadening this a little bit. How do these negotiations work in reality? And we're always in the U.S. seeing ourselves sending envoys over. Are they perceived as honest brokers? Are they able to get both sides of the table, especially given that imbalance that CK is pointing out? How does that work?
I don't think that it's a good question, and I don't think that the frame should actually ever be honest broker, because I agree. It's even if the U.S. is able to be an honest broker, it will be difficult for folks in the region to accept that, given the importance of U.S.-Israel relationship, and given not just the $3.8 billion in annual military aid, but just all of the intense connections between Israeli society and American society. So the question, I don't think, is actually whether the United States can be an honest broker. I think the question is whether the United States can be an effective broker. Because to be an effective broker, what it means is bringing Israel to the table and making Israelis feel supported, and making Israelis feel that the United States will have their back, which is very important to the Israelis. And I think that probably the most important, not the only, but the most important variable in getting Israel to the table and in getting Israel to agree to things it's going to have to agree to, while also convincing the Palestinians that it can deliver a deal from the Israelis that will respect Palestinian sovereignty, that will respect Palestinian rights, and that will give Palestinians a viable sovereign state. And to go back to the Trump plan, one of the reasons that it was so problematic was that the configuration laid out there was never going to convince any Palestinians that that the United States was able to actually guarantee a viable sovereign Palestinian state. And so I don't think it's important or even certainly not possible, but even necessary to convince Palestinians that the U.S. will be an honest broker. I think, as I said, you have to convince them that you can be an effective broker. And so that means obviously when there are negotiations, which I should note would not be a good idea right now because they would fail. But when there are negotiations, it means being the party that convenes the sides, and being in the room and overseeing everything. But one of the things that the Palestinian Authority and the PLO were saying during the Trump years was that going forward, the U.S. cannot be the only actor. It cannot crowd everybody else out. It can be one actor alongside the Russians or the Gulf states or the United Nations. And I think that that model would have been important going forward anyway. But I think that particularly in order to be effective going forward, it will have to be that sort of thing where the U.S. is the most important outside player in the room. But it is going to be important to bring in other parties to reassure the Palestinians and to make sure that there are other perspectives. And if the U.S. does that in a way that is able to make the Israelis feel supported, but also coax the Israelis along and make them come accept some things that may be uncomfortable for them to accept, while convincing the Palestinians that we aren't just out to kind of get the best deal possible for the Israelis. We're out to actually get a deal that will work for both sides and it will hold. Then yes, the U.S. can be an effective broker, and that's what it'll be.
Okay, thank you. We have a question who asks, is the insistence of the Palestinians on a right of return of every Palestinian identified by UNRWA as a refugee a stumbling block to ever having a final peace agreement?
It's a stumbling block if the Palestinian right of return means Palestinians going back to what is now the state of Israel. Because if that happens in large enough numbers, then Israel ceases to be a Jewish state, and Israelis will never agree to that. Not without cause, by the way, right? There is no reason why Jews shouldn't be able to have their own national sovereign movement. If it means Palestinians returning, to what should be a state of Palestine, then there's no reason why that should be a barrier at all. And in any successful negotiation between the two sides, this of course is one of the four core issues, and it will be addressed. I think that at that point, then Palestinians who want to return to a state of Palestine, even if it means not returning to where they lived before 1948, that will be something that should happen. But if it does mean a return to anywhere and everywhere, then that will be a poison pill that kills any type of two-state outcome.
Thank you. Just wanted to end with one final question, and thank you so much for just the depth with which you've gone into everything. When you're looking ahead, are there certain key events or milestones that you think would indicate, okay, we're heading in, potentially a positive direction here, positive being, overwhelmingly, let's look at something peaceful, or are there certain events, milestones, markers that you would keep an eye on, that you'd be like, oh, this doesn't look good for an outcome?
On the Israeli side, as I said, there's no appetite across the Israeli political spectrum, except for a few parties on the left, to enter into real negotiations right now over a Palestinian state. That's just it's at the moment it's a dead issue. But there are plenty of people, particularly in the center, and some of the parties that are now talking about forming a change government. Yair Lapid, who's the head of Yesh Atid, Benny Gantz, who's the head of Kahol Lavan, Blue and White, some others. I think that among them, there's a real recognition that that Israel can take steps to quiet the situation and to not be overly provocative. So some of the stuff in East Jerusalem and some of the more provocative actions in the West Bank, I think that if we see a government formed that quietly stops some of this stuff, that will be a positive marker on the Israeli side. Again, it's important to kind of keep in mind the limitations of this. It's only going to go so far, but even small steps at this point would be good. On the Palestinian side, if the PA and Israel and the U.S. and the rest of the international community is really willing to hold Hamas's feet to the fire on Gaza reconstruction, and there can be some sort of return of the Palestinian Authority to Gaza and in charge of this process, that will be a really good marker as well. The one thing that frightens me more than anything else is on the Palestinian side, actually on the Israeli side, if the government actually goes forward with annexation in the next couple of years, that would be an absolute game changer. On the Palestinian side, the post-Abbas period is going to be critical because who replaces Abbas and what it looks like is going to determine the next, decade or 2 decades of this conflict and of Palestinian politics. And if when President Abbas goes, there is either civil war on the Palestinian side over succession, or whoever takes over takes Fatah in a more confrontational direction, then that will introduce a level of instability into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That sort of, along with annexation, would introduce instability that I think will just lead to directions that we perhaps haven't seen in decades.
Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone who listened, and have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Great.
Take care.
Thanks, Courtney.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us today on Global Insights. If you're looking for more in-depth analysis and want to be part of our vibrant community, head over to network2020.org.